Just over a week before the commencement of the famous 1940 evacuation of the shattered British Expeditionary Force and some of their French allies from the beaches of Dunkirk, British soldiers were sent on a desperate rescue mission, crossing the English Channel from Dover to the Netherlands, itself under ferocious German attack, with a specific objective in mind. Numbering only a battalion in strength, the outnumbered and outgunned soldiers were drawn from two of the famous Guards regiments that provided ceremonial guards at Buckingham Palace and elsewhere and provided the King's security. This is the forgotten story of Harpoon Force, when men from the Irish and Welsh Guards undertook a vital mission in support of Britain's Dutch ally. When World War II broke out in September 1939, the Netherlands remained, as it had in World War I, neutral. Though it mobilized its small armed forces, without significant French or British help, it couldn't hope to fight off a German invasion. The Dutch royal family, however, had long-standing familial ties to the British royal family. In 1940, the monarch of the Netherlands was Queen Wilhelmina, and through her father she was related to British King George II, and therefore also to the World War II British monarch George VI. On the 10th of May 1940, the German onslaught in the west began with attacks on France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Some help quickly arrived in the form of French troops, then came some British. The German attack was very modern, including the extensive use of paratroopers that had been landed around The Hague and also seized the airfields around the city. The Dutch government was in danger of being cut off and taken prisoner. The Dutch had assumed that the British would start to pour troops into the Netherlands, as they had in France and Norway, but the British army was completely overstretched, and the German advance was progressing too quickly in the Netherlands. At midnight on the 11th of May 1940, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion Irish Guards, one of the 5 regiments of foot guards that guarded the royal family, was summoned to the headquarters of the 20th Guards Brigade. This year marks the 125th anniversary of the formation of the Irish Guards, and it's being celebrated by the regiment with events leading up to St. Patrick's Day 2026. The Irish Guards recruit across the whole of Ireland, including the British province of Northern Ireland and the then Irish Free State in the south, its ranks in World War II full of both Catholics and Protestants. It had proved itself the match of the other Guards regiments, distinguishing itself in the Boer War and in World War I. However, the Irish Guards were now to face a very challenging assignment that would require all of their experience and tenacity to achieve. The 2nd Battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hayden, met with Brigadier William Fox Pitt of 20 Brigade, who informed him that he was to take charge of a composite battalion found from the understrength 2nd Irish Guards, reinforced by 1 company of the Welsh Guards. The mission, when outlined, was a very risky deal. Hayden's force, codenamed Harpoon, was to cross the North Sea and land in the Netherlands at the Hook of Holland, then advance on foot to The Hague and rescue the Dutch royal family, the Dutch government, and the British diplomatic personnel, and escort them safely to the coast and get them away on Royal Navy destroyers. The Germans had full aerial superiority over the Netherlands, and this infantry force would be almost without motor transport, had extremely few anti-tank weapons, and minimal support. The assignment had all the makings of a one-way trip, but British obligations to the Dutch meant that it had to be tried. The responsibility placed on Hayden's shoulders was immense, and it was made clear that failure was not an option. Hayden, however, knew that he could rely on his mix, as the Irish Guards affectionately call themselves, and though often in fierce competition with the other Foot Guards regiments, he knew both the abilities of his own men and of the 200 Welsh Guardsmen who had helped to reinforce his battalion. Arriving at Dover on Sunday the 12th of May after hasty preparations, Harpoon Force was herded aboard 2 requisition cross-channel ferries and escorted by destroyers. The crossing would be very risky, particularly as they approached the Dutch coast, as they would be exposed to German aircraft. The two slow, lumbering ferries would be easy targets for Luftwaffe Stukas if they were caught at sea. The crossing took all night in rough weather, with many of the guardsmen becoming seasick. As dawn broke on Monday, the 13th of May, the force reached the Hook of Holland. Pools of smoke rising from numerous fires ashore were testimony to German aerial bombing. The dawn sky to the east was red from the fires of burning Rotterdam, heavily damaged by the Luftwaffe. In total, Harpoon Force consisted of 651 all ranks. Its only vehicles were a couple of wireless lorries. Regarding weapons, apart from the standard Lee-Enfield rifles, and some Thompson submachine guns and the officers' Webley pistols, the only support weapons were Bryn light machine guns, some extremely unpopular Boy's anti-tank rifles, and a handful of 3-inch mortars, with a limited supply of bombs. However, it was expected that the Royal Navy destroyers that escorted Harpoon Force could be called upon to provide naval gunfire support if required, though the destroyers themselves remained very exposed to German dive-bomber attacks. However, awaiting Harpoon Force at the Hook of Holland was an even smaller and more ad hoc formation. 200 Royal Marines, under the command of Major Mitchell, scrounged up from various warships and shore establishments who had earlier been sent across to secure the docks for the arrival of Harpoon Force. As Harpoon Force was disembarking from its transport vessels, it received the first of many attacks by German Stukas, Hitler's flying artillery, and the men were strafed. Bren guns were used in a vain attempt to fend off these attacks. Queen Wilhelmina and her family and attendants, the diplomatic staff from the British Embassy, and some of the Dutch government had abandoned The Hague and were driving in convoys of cars towards Harpoon Force's positions. Colonel Hayden was informed of this move, saving him the problem of having to find transport and advance along the road to The Hague to cover the entire route to the docks, as per his original orders. But he immediately dispatched companies and platoons out to form a thinly held perimeter around the town and to provide security for the last part of the road. Throughout the morning of the 13th of May, the Irish and Welsh Guards sub-units came under increasingly heavy aerial attack. Stookers howling down to bomb and strafe traffic on the road, including refugee columns, and also hitting some of Harpoon Force's positions. German sniper and machine gun fire was also being received from the countryside as German ground forces moved in on the British perimeter. Around midday, a long procession of black cars swept down the road and into Harpoon Force's position. This was Queen Wilhelmina's party. The Queen was escorted through the burning town to the quayside, and after some discussion with the British naval commander, boarded HMS Hereward for an express run back to the UK and safety. Queen Wilhelmina would become head of the Dutch government in exile in London and a focus of Dutch resistance to the Germans. The first of the colonel's objectives had now been completed, but Hayden could not expect to evacuate just yet. The British embassy staff and the Dutch government had to be similarly rescued. Harpoon Force remained holding its positions under increasingly intense air attack and some ground fire as well, until finally at 6 p.m. another convoy of cars was halted by Harpoon Force sentries. The cars contained members of the Dutch government, and behind this cavalcade came more cars containing the longed-for British diplomats. In chaotic scenes, these civilians were herded under fire aboard waiting Royal Navy destroyers for immediate evacuation to England. But still Harpoon Force remained, with orders to hold the Hook of Holland. A plan was in fact underway to bring over the rest of the Welsh Guards Battalion as reinforcements and keep possession of the vital port. In the meantime, German medium bombers attacked, causing serious casualties among the guardsmen. 7 were killed and 23 wounded. A local doctor persuaded the British to allow him to drive 3 seriously wounded guardsmen to a hospital in The Hague for treatment. These men survived but were duly taken prisoner by the Germans. The night of the 13th to 14th of May was long and tiring. Harpoon Force stood to all night and received several aerial attacks. By the 14th of May, it was becoming obvious that holding the Hook of Holland was pointless. The Netherlands was collapsing, and large-scale German parachute landings were occurring everywhere. Reinforcing Harpoon Force with the balance of the Welsh Guards Battalion would merely result in the loss of 2 battalions. Patrols sent out beyond the defence perimeter began to clash with serious numbers of German forces. More waves of Luftwaffe bombing caused more British casualties. Masses of refugees fleeing the Germans continued to pour into the British perimeter. The Guardsmen watched with helpless fury as Stukas bombed and strafed defenceless civilian columns with impunity. During the constant bombing, the Royal Navy destroyers were held well offshore, but with his wireless trucks destroyed, Colonel Hayden couldn't easily communicate with the ships to coordinate getting his command out. However, a brave Irish guardsman clambered to the top of a windmill and, ignoring sniper fire, began to communicate with the ships using semaphore flags. Soon afterwards, Hayden began to collapse his perimeter, ordering units to disengage and make their way to the port for embarkation. The docks were by now a burning mess, as German bombs had destroyed all of Harpoon Force's stores, and ammunition was cooking off everywhere. The wait for the destroyers to come in was interminable, all the while under German aerial bombing and strafing. Finally, 3 destroyers, HMS Whitshed, Vesper and Malcolm, came alongside, and in half platoons the Irish and Welsh Guards boarded. The destroyers then moved out to sea with Harpoon Force safely embarked and headed for Dover. During the 8-hour crossing, the destroyers were intermittently attacked by German aircraft, but finally at 10 p.m. on the 14th of May 1940 they arrived safely at Dover. The next day the Netherlands capitulated. The following day, Harpoon Force was sent back to Camberley, from whence they had departed on their daring mission days before. If Harpoon Force had not been sent, it is doubtful that the Dutch royal family and government and the British diplomats could have so easily escaped. Today, a number of Irish and Welsh Guardsmen remain buried at the Hook of Holland and in villages around there. The mission for which they gave their lives quickly overshadowed by the vast tragedy of Dunkirk, and today the action of Harpoon Force is little known. That it was successful was down to the professionalism and dedication of the British Guardsmen and the Royal Marines that prevailed on an ad hoc mission which was ill prepared and sent into action without proper support or a clear exit strategy. We must also remember the gallant behaviour of the sailors manning the destroyers that shared the dangers with the land force. 9 members of the Irish Guards and 2 from the Welsh Guards were killed in action on this operation, and today are buried in the Netherlands. Lieutenant Colonel Hayden received the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership of Harpoon Force, and would go on to a glittering career in the World War II British Commandos. Several other officers and men were decorated for this difficult operation. Today, the Irish Guards continue to rotate between public duties in London and active combat and training operations all over the world. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.